Support for the Nocturnists comes from the California Medical Association.
At the Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
You're listening to The Nocturnists, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. Today, we're featuring the fifth and final story from our live show in New York City in November 2023. It's a show we co-produced with Danielle Ofri and Ashley McMullen from the literary magazine Bellevue Literary Review on the theme of taking care. This story came from family medicine physician Zed Zha, who wanted nothing more than a scoop of Baskin-Robbins ice cream while growing up as a girl in China. Decades later, Zed finds herself a family medicine physician in the United States, standing in a Baskin-Robbins with her reluctant parents who are visiting from China, trying to persuade them to indulge in the forbidden treat. After the story, Zed and I talk about the pressures of being an only child under China's one-child policy, the romance of rural family medicine, and the way Zed's mom doesn't speak much English and yet is able to make friends anywhere she goes. They say family medicine doctors can do it all, and in Zed's case, that seems to include comedic storytelling, because this performance had the audience in stitches. So take a listen to Zed's story from our live show in New York City. It's called The American 31 Flavor Ice Cream.
It's January 2020, and I am a brand new attending doctor, driving my brand new secondhand SUV down the highway toward my brand new house in Eastern Washington State. In the passenger seat sits my brand new husband, whom I've had for 5 years. In the back seat sit my parents, whom I just picked up from the Seattle airport. They're sound asleep, my car is quiet, except for their peaceful breathing and my racing heartbeat. My parents have just arrived from China to visit me. In the past 12 years I've been in the United States, we've only seen each other a handful of times. And this time, looking through the backup mirror, my parents look a lot older than last time I saw them. My mom's hair is thinning, so she's wearing a perm to hide it. And the lines on my dad's forehead are carved a lot deeper than last time I saw him. And I am consumed by guilt. You see, in the Chinese culture, out of all the virtues, being good to your parents comes first. And I had not been a good daughter. I am their only child and left home when I was 20 to pursue a medical career on the other side of the world, draining all of their savings along the way. But this time, things are different. I'm no longer that starving medical student or resident, and I have a plan to make it up for my parents. At my house, I prepared a whole fridge of foods they've never tried before. I bought them new sheets, a new comforter, a new rice cooker, and this time actually brand new, not secondhand. And with this plan comes this declaration. I am the product of my parents' hard work and sacrifice, and I am worth it. But more importantly, from now on, I will be taking care of them. And what's the first step to my master plan? Stopping at Baskin-Robbins for ice cream. I glanced at the GPS. We're only a minute away from the exact store I picked out. My palms are starting to get sweaty, my heart rate is elevating, and I'm starting to hyperventilate. By the time I see that big Baskin-Robbins logo, I fully met sepsis criteria. I turn sharply into the parking lot and slam into a parking spot right outside the store. Then I turn to the back seat and say, "Mom, Dad, want some ice cream?" Then I see the look on my mom's face. Like a reflex, I close my eyes and clench my teeth like I'm getting ready for a slap in the face. "No, we do not want ice cream," my mom says. And I feel myself sinking into the seat, deflating into a small child. Now, before you think the story is brought to you by Baskin-Robbins, let me just take you back 32 years ago, the day when I was born. The doctor who delivered me misdiagnosed me with brain damage at birth. And my mother, who didn't even finish middle school, didn't understand what that meant. That means she'll be stupid, the doctor explained to her. In the one-child policy era in China, the only child was not just child, but also the hopes and dreams of the entire family. And mine was about to get crushed. The doctors recommended I be put up for adoption, and my mother tried to protest, but it was her words against the patriarchy. So a few weeks after giving birth, my mother found herself standing in front of a lockdown adoption facility where her baby girl was kept among other brain-damaged kids, waiting to be taken away. Now, if what happens next were to be made into a kung fu movie, my mother would be played by the Oscar-winning Michelle Yeoh, and it's gonna look like this. She arrives after dark in front of the evil castle, aka the hospital, dressed all in black. Then like a bird, she flies up from the ground, tapping her toes a few times along the walls as she ascends and lands inside the evil castle without making a single sound. Then she takes out her sword and fights her way through the villains, aka the doctors, and makes her way to her baby girl. But the reality was a lot less pretty. Just a few weeks postpartum, my mother was probably still bleeding from her womb. And now, she's bleeding from her heart too. Because after climbing over the walls of the hospital, she discovered the room where they kept me was locked, so she couldn't get in to steal me out. But according to my mother, among all the babies in the adoption unit, I was the only one who cried when I heard her footsteps. So the next morning, my mother returned to the hospital by herself and signed me out against medical advice. In my imagination, after signing those papers, when she threw that pen back at the doctors, it sounded exactly like a sword pushed back to its scabbard. My mother told everyone I was not stupid because stupid babies couldn't recognize their mother's footsteps. But no one believed her. Instead, people gossiped. She'll never be able to understand mathematics. She won't make it to college, and she can't take care of her parents. And that is how I ended up at age 15 on the back seat of my mother's secondhand bicycle, weekend after weekend. My mother is pedaling fast and furious to take me to the weekend private classes of physics, chemistry, and mathematics. The gritty metal seat of the bike makes the ride really uncomfortable, so I hug my mom's waist tightly for stability. Everything looks gray in Beijing due to air pollution, except for the Baskin-Robbins we pass by every week. The big pink circle with the number 31 in it is like the only color I see. Not knowing how to pronounce Baskin-Robbins, my mother and I called it the American 31 flavor ice cream. And this is when she makes her empty promise to me every single weekend. Okay, honey, one day we'll stop by for ice cream, okay? 3 scoops, whatever flavor you like, I promise. But the private weekend classes are expensive. Before I can even enter the classrooms, I hand over a stash of cash to the teachers. And this is how I know, at the end of the week, we do not have any money left for ice cream. Plus, other than chocolate and vanilla, how many more ice cream flavors can there really be? Now, fast forward 18 years, back in Washington State. My mother is now sitting at the back of my secondhand SUV, rejecting my offer to take us to have the ice cream of our dreams, ruining the very first step to my master plan. If I let her defeat me now, what's going to happen when we get home? And if she won't let me take care of her, then all of our hard work trying to prove those gossips wrong, and all of the years we spent apart, and all the monies I drained would totally be wasted. I can't let that happen. But luckily for everyone, I've been to the morning market with my mother in China enough times. I know exactly how to bargain with the Chinese woman without arguing. So I turn to her and I say, okay, whatever, suit yourself, I want some ice cream. So I hop off the car and I start walking to the ice cream shop by myself. Then behind me, I hear my dad's footsteps shuffling. Then my mother sighs and she comes off the car and slams the door. Inside the ice cream shop, there is a young girl with a bored teenager look on her face. Hello, I would like to get 3 scoops of ice cream in a cone, please. I've never actually been to a Baskin-Robbins, but I need to act like I come here all the time. Okay, what kind of cone, she says. Oh, that bigger one? Okay, waffle cone then, what flavors? Flavors, okay, it's gonna be chocolate, vanilla, and that one over there. Then my dad comes in, and right away he leans forward to study all the different chocolate flavors there were. Then my mother comes in, and her mouth just drops open. Then she starts to count the flavors. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, don't let my mother catch you having fewer flavors than you advertised, because she will be asking you for a discount, okay? 22, 23, 24. And her eyes get wider as the numbers grow. Then she looks over to my dad, who looks like he might fall into the ice cream buckets if he got any closer to them. My mother makes this hissing sound whenever she's displeased, and it sounds weirdly dismissive, like this. So she turns to my dad and says, and that translates into, stop acting like you want ice cream. Then she turns to me and says, 这些也太贵了吧，你会不会省点钱？有那些钱去别的地方买一整顿饭就可以了。不要，不要，坚决不要。And as she gets more and more passionate about scolding me, her voice gets louder. She scolds me for my terrible habit of wasting money, because with that kind of money, I could have gone somewhere else and gotten a whole meal. And how dare I, a 32-year-old professional woman, a doctor, spend $10 on ice cream to make her mother happy? Now imagine if you were the poor ice cream girl in the shop. 1 minute, your biggest problem was boredom. Then comes in this Asian woman with a big perm. Then she starts to hiss and yell and terrorize all these other Asian people in your store. So she turns over to Matthew for help, my husband, who's the only other non-Chinese person in the room. And Matthew gestures, don't look at me, I don't know what's going on. So suddenly, the room becomes quiet, and everyone turns to look at me. It feels like there are beams of light coming out of everybody's eyes, and they form this single cone of spotlight that lands perfectly on me. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not the hero in this kung fu movie. And no matter how much I'm bleeding inside, I need to act like I'm effortless on the outside. So I roll up my sleeves, and I speak to the ice cream girl. Okay, we take some chocolate almonds, world-class chocolate and peanut butter in a dipped waffle cone for him. For her, we get some cotton candy, nutty coconut, winter white chocolate, also in a dipped waffle cone, please and thank you. And under my rapid fire, the ice cream girl blinks herself awake and says, oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Any toppings? I'm glad you asked. We'll take some sprinkles, M&Ms, gummy worms, and girl, if you have some sunshine and rainbow and unicorn eyelashes, I'll take some of those too. I need you to make these 2 ice creams look ridiculous. Okay? Okay. And let me tell you, she does not disappoint me. In a few minutes, she turns around and hands over these 2 giant dipped ice creams with the whole world balanced on them, shouldering endless possibilities. By the time I'm done paying for these 2 ice creams, half of my deathbed chocolate's already gone. Then I hear my mother whisper behind me, wow, American 31 flavor ice cream. So I turn to look at her, and she's taking a selfie with the ice cream. Like a tourist in front of the Statue of Liberty. Thank you.
I am sitting here with Dr. Zed Zha. Zed, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you are such a natural performer. Did you have any performance background before you got up on stage?
I didn't, but thank you for saying that. I did do a roast in my residency, for my third year class when I was an intern for their graduation, and that was pretty well received. So maybe that was a preview of my comic relief ability.
Well, tell us about your path to medicine. It sounds like you were in medical school in Beijing when you decided to move to the United States. So tell us about that decision to move and how you picked up your medical training here in the US.
So I grew up in Beijing, China until I was 20 years old. And I was already 2 years into my medical school training out of the 8-year program that I was about to do. I had the idea of coming to the United States because I wanted to become a family physician, primary care. Primary care in China right now is pretty rudimentary as a specialty. And so I thought I'd come to the United States instead. And I figured, having already been in medical school, I could just transfer to another medical school in another country and easy peasy. Until I came here and I realized I had to restart undergraduate and reapply for medical school after graduating. So that resulted in me repeating 2 years of undergrad. So I did 6 years of undergrad altogether. And then I applied for a medical school, which was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life yet, because I did not realize that being an international student on a visa would become such a big obstacle in applying for medical school. And I think today, international students who are on student visa are still not accepted into medical school the same proportion as people who have green cards or are citizens. And so that was difficult. But I was lucky enough to have gotten into Dartmouth Medical School, who gave me a good education, but also a very good financial aid. So that was very, very nice. So that's what introduced me to New England as a person who grew up in a 40 million people town in Beijing to a 8,000 people town in New Hampshire.
You said that in China, you knew you wanted to do family medicine, but that family medicine practice in China is not fully formed, or I think you said rudimentary. How did you know you wanted to do family medicine if it wasn't as much developed in China? And why isn't it developed in China?
I think I have always had this romantic idea of what a doctor ought to be. Growing up, thinking there is going to be one person that I go to or my family would go to for all my medical care troubles. And this person would guide me through life-altering events and help me take care of my parents, help me take care of my grandparents, all these things. Until I realized that everybody specialized in China at that point. And you do your own triage and deciding, today I have abdominal pain. Does that mean I go to a gastroenterologist, or does that mean I go to general surgery? Either you triage yourself at the hospital or the triage nurse triages you when you walk in. There isn't a put it together person for anyone. And then as a result, almost each time you go into the hospital or the clinic, you either encounter somebody completely new than last time, or you would end up going to the emergency room or urgent care to get triaged that way. And so that lack of continuity or relational medicine really was not what I thought it was. And so that's when I decided to pursue that kind of medicine somewhere else. I don't really quite know what's the reason why we don't have robust primary care in China yet. My understanding, I am in touch with some of my colleagues in China who are part of the medical education, medical reform, and primary care is one of the emphases of this reform. So I'm really happy to hear about that.
So what was it like going from a city of 30 million people to rural America?
When I arrived at the small town I lived in New Hampshire, I lived in an even smaller place for 4 years in medical school outside of Hanover, New Hampshire, which is already small. So I lived in a town of 2,000 people, Orford, New Hampshire. A lovely town, and just I consider it my second home in America. Wonderful people. I remember arriving there and realizing I might be the only person who was Chinese in town. And I remember a couple years later, another person with a Chinese name moved into down the street, not that close, but maybe a few streets down in Orford. And I remember getting their mails delivered to me. And I thought, oh, goodness, now that that person moved in, the Chinese population in town just doubled virtually. So that was a very different experience.
And do you like the quiet aspect of rural life compared to the hustle and bustle of Beijing? Or how did you adjust your sensibility? Because that is such a big change to go from a megacity to rural Washington state.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was probably one of the hardest transitions coming to the United States, besides, the language, the food, and all these other customs and things like that. I've come to really embrace having space around me and providing space for my parents, my friends. And I think coming to realize that people also need space and people thrive in a little bit more space around them, or certain people do, like myself. I have come to embrace that. And so I do enjoy it right now. I think sometimes when I need a dose of big city, I drive to Seattle or go somewhere, have a good weekend, hang out there and things like that. So that's how I balance it. One of my biggest issues is that I don't have a good Asian grocery store around me. Whenever I go to Seattle or things like that, I take a big cooler with me and get all the stuff I could in one trip.
I want to get into your story, but I just still am so curious about your practice. I just have such respect for family medicine doctors who work in rural areas because, as you mentioned, there isn't a lot of access to specialty care. What do you feel like people need to know about practicing medicine kind of on your own in a rural area? Like, I don't know, maybe I am romanticizing it a little bit too for the doctor, but it kind of feels a little bit like jack of all trades, delivering a baby, hospice care, cradle to grave, all of that stuff. Obviously, there's a side of it that's hard because you are on your own. So I would love to hear more about that because I've mostly been in big cities and academic centers where you have world experts just a phone call away.
I've talked to a lot of people about it, both in the professional setting and advising new grads. So I've thought a lot about this. People thrive in having a therapeutic relationship, and that relationship is a lot of what we do, and it's a lot of where healing happens. And that's where we really come in to shine. As rural family physicians, we get to take care of generations of people in really profound ways. I remember one day during the pandemic, I was taking care of somebody in hospice. I just was holding somebody's hand as they passed away. Then I came out to the next room where my patient was in labor and catching a baby almost minutes apart was something that I never thought I would do. And I think that's something that really empowered me to look within myself and how do I become the physician that people need, not just people, but their families need. And how do I become the physician that my family need me to be as well? And so people who go into rural medicine really do need to be pretty brave. Sometimes we have to be a little cowboy when it comes to things. But at the same time, I think that having been my first job outside of residency, where I still had the habit of looking to things academically, had a critical analysis view of medicine, I still was very prone to looking into the data for everything I practiced and knowing that I didn't know everything, far from it. And so I was ready to jump into the data and dig through and read more and self-educate. I think that is what's really going to keep a rural medicine doctor good at what they do, just that piece of self-discipline, self-education. But I also think that that's the part that can get lost as time goes on, which I was scared to see if I were to stay in rural medicine for a long period of time. So that balance between staying academic, having trained and studied in academic centers, and going to rural medicine where you kind of have to invent things as you go in terms of what can be done and what cannot be done. And a lot of times people are not able to get anything done unless it's done by you. That is a drive of self-education. It's a scary factor, but it's a sense of honor and responsibility, which I think are very romantic. You said that you had romantic views of rural family physicians. I still do, even though I've been in it for a while. And I think that sense of honor, responsibility, and just longitudinal care needs to be nurtured systemically and individually, both by the system. And when I say system, I mean the work environment in a small scale, but also nationally, policy-wise.
When you're practicing in a rural area, do you have colleagues you can run cases by? Is there a way to minimize the loneliness? You mentioned staying up to date with the evidence and studying and reading articles and going to the data, but what about other clinicians? Is there a way to get together and have a few beers and talk about
Oh my goodness.
about patients?
I was in minus the beer because as a family physician, delivered babies and also did pediatrics, and as a women physician as well, I became pretty popular pretty fast when it came to the baby delivery scene. And so almost every day I was on call for my own patient who were in labor. After 36 weeks, I kept my phone on. So I would say after 1 year of being there, having established myself in the community, my phone was always on. And I did not have a single drink. I felt like for 3 years. So minus the beer for sure. Yeah, but definitely building that community. And I think you do come to have pretty close-knit community within the organization, the physicians, and you've come to realize what a difference it would make to be able to text and call your colleagues versus having to call and consult and be on the line, things like that. So I think that make a difference. And the other thing I want to say is that our rural nurses, they are honorary doctors themselves, I would say. When I was in training, of course, like part of your job is to be able to respond to everything that everybody pages you for, right? But in rural practice, because you are one of the only doctors in town, and nurses and staff know that you are so overworked, you're so busy, and you sometimes can really be pretty burnt out. So when they call you, they have thought about it and studied it and discussed it, and really they need you when they do. So I think that has really changed my view of how collaborative healthcare has been. And so pretty soon after my rural practice as a full spectrum family medicine doctor, I come to learn that when the nurse calls you, don't go brush your teeth or put your pretty glasses on or contact lenses on. You just grab whatever you have and you roll out of bed and you just go. You jump in your car and you drive to the hospital, and then you have time to relax over there. But when they need you, when they call you, they really need you. And that's what I come to appreciate. Rural nurses, I think they're big heroes.
So in your story, you talk a lot about your birth story, and you mentioned the one-child policy in China. I think most people have heard of the one-child policy, but they may not exactly know what that is or what that was or why that was. Can you tell us about the one-child policy so that we can understand a bit more about what happened to you and your family?
Yes. So my mom, she was born in the 1960s. She was born to the generation of hairy mother, a generation where women were encouraged to have many, many kids, and then they were rewarded for doing so. China at that point needed workforce and expansion of our population. So that happened. And I think that might have overshot to a point that our resources did not support the growth of population that we had. So then in my generation, almost it felt like in one generation of time, we went from huge families to you can only have one child. Growing up, all of my friends, all of my classmates, almost everyone I encounter were only children. And so we've come to really view each other more like sisters and brothers. And I talk about my cousins and my friends as sisters and brothers too in my culture. And so everyone in my generation are only children. The one-child policy is not in place anymore today. But I think that one generation shift from a huge family to only child has done a lot of perspective shifting in China as well. I could tell, my parents live with me now, and I could tell the way they talk about we and I are different than the way I talk about we and I. I think that's also affected by the fact that I became an American citizen last year. I'm more Americanized in a lot of ways than before. So I think that individualism versus collectiveness was really amplified in that one generation shift.
I'm also an only child, and I have two girls, and it's been really cool and interesting to watch them develop this sibling relationship. It's not something I ever experienced, so I'm new to this as an observer. And so when you say that everyone was an only child, like that's just so wild to think about.
Yeah.
Can you say more about what that was like?
I think that as a result has really given me a fascination of people's sibling stories. I cannot get enough of sibling stories. I remember one of my classmates, just one out of the 60 people in my class in high school, had a younger sister, a younger sibling just altogether. So she wrote an article as a literary exercise in high school called I Am a Big Sister. And that was just mind opening to read that. I remember just borrowing her notebook, where she wrote the article and just read it time after time after time. I just relished it. And I remember making a copy of it and thinking about that article all the time, just the fascination of having another person to love and having another person to bounce ideas off of, but also having another person to reflect on about yourself and about your parents really was something that was unheard of. So today, sometimes I tell people or patients or my friends, hey, I'm not trying to be weird, but can you tell me more about your sister? What is it like to have a brother? Things like that. And that's really driven my interest in people's stories like that.
It sounds like there was at least one person in your class who had a sibling, which presumably was against this one-child policy. If a couple had more than one child, what would the government do, or what would happen to them? Would they take the child away? What was the punishment for breaking the policy?
The person who had a sister, she belonged to a ethnic minority. We have over 56 ethnic minority groups in China who have their own customs and language. And she belonged to one of them. And the policy in terms of how many kids you could have at that time was different for ethnic minorities.
So it sounds like when you were born, there was this idea that there was some kind of brain injury or something like that. And the doctor said to your mom, your baby is going to have brain damage, or I think you said is going to be dumb or something like that.
Stupid,
Clearly, you
yeah.
are not dumb going to Dartmouth Medical School on a full scholarship. So what happened there? What was with that misdiagnosis?
Yeah, I think that also speaks to the lack of continuity of care in China at that point too. At some point, I had pretty high bilirubin, and then I think that I was treated under phototherapy pretty intensely. And the doctors must have thought that I had kernicterus, which is a form of cerebral palsy. And so they admitted me to the hospital to work me up for that. And then in the process, there must have been some kind of miscommunication, misdiagnosis, whatever it is. I was in the hospital and then they determined, the word that they used was that this child is going to become stupid, which, by the way, I do not think people living with CP are stupid. This is the quote I was told. And so then, because of the one-child policy, which was really a big deal for families like mine who did not come from a lot of generational wealth or status, my family really needed someone to be that person in the family, to change the story of my family, to become somebody, to make something out of herself or himself. So that became clear to the doctors and my family that with kernicterus, it was not going to be me. And so that's when they thought they were making the ethical recommendation to have me given up for adoption.
And that was a decision the doctors made and that your mother was not allowed to make?
I believe my family also agreed to it, except for my mother. I think that the woman's or mother's consent at that point must not have mattered.
And she snuck in and got you back. I love the part of your story where you imagine your mom as Michelle Yeoh, the actress, like a ninja sneaking into the hospital. Is that a story your mom told you from the time you were really little? Have you heard that story again and again and again from her?
I've heard the story a few times, and each time I hear the story, the action in that kung fu movie became even more vivid and fancier. The way she said it was, I climbed over the wall and snuck in the hospital, and I heard you cry for me, and I thought to myself, my baby is not stupid. Stupid babies don't cry for their mothers when they just hear their footsteps. That's the version I heard. And I don't think she says much about it. I remember she mentioning her feeling of heartbreak when she finally got me back, because she saw that clearly the doctors were trying to get a lumbar puncture through so that they could assess my spinal fluid. When she got me back, she counted 11 needle holes on my back. And that just broke her. She still looks like she might cry when she talks about that today. She's like, I just don't know if any mother could endure that kind of treatment without knowing what was going on. And so she said, even if you couldn't have mounted to become anyone, I would still steal you back.
Tell us about your mom's personality.
My mom is a very positive person. She is so friendly. She doesn't speak much English. Today she lives in Washington State with me. She could go out in the community, walk around, and just come back with 5 people's contact numbers because she somehow made friends with them who didn't speak English. And I remember one day she went to a car show and she came back with like 25 photos of her posing at different antique cars, different people, different owners, And I said, Mom, who took photos of you? She's like, oh, I just made a bunch of friends who went around with me and took photos of me without speaking the same language at all. And then she recently made a friend in the thrift store here in town, and her name is Deb. And she came to me, she said, Deb is Irish. And I was like, okay, I think maybe Deb might be Irish American. But either way, she's Irish and I'm Chinese and we've become friends. And so she somehow learned that Deb was going to retire from the thrift store job. I think she just was going to go on vacation and she was going to travel somewhere. So my mom was heartbroken about it. And she said, I'm going to make Deb some food for her goodbye gift. So she made a whole pot of dumplings. It must have been like 30 to 40 homemade dumplings. And then it was pretty hot during the day. It was in the middle of August heat. She carried the pot of dumplings 2 miles down the road because she walks everywhere. She walked there and she had lunch with Debbie at her work. And she invited all these people from Deb's workplace. And they had like this great impromptu homemade Chinese food lunch. And they took selfies. And then Deb didn't actually quit her job at the thrift store. She just went on vacation and she went back from another state. And my mom came back home one day and she's like, look what Deb got me. Deb had gone to the farmer's market where she was traveling and got a really cute heart-shaped handmade chime for my mom and her house. And she brought it home. Her ability to just make the most out of her situation and stay positive and stay optimistic is so encouraging. And it's really affected a lot of people, myself included.
You mentioned that during the time of the one-child policy, there was this idea that if you only get one child and you only get one shot, that there is a lot of pressure on that child to bring success to the family, to perform well. And I'm wondering the extent to which you felt that pressure, or did that pressure play at all into your decision to go into medicine and to come to the United States? And you also talked about gossip in the community, particularly around you, since there had been this initial diagnosis of jaundice leading to brain damage. Like, how did you navigate that, the pressure and the gossip? And it seems like a lot to handle.
The gossip mostly came from my grandma's family, whom we were pretty close to. My grandma was one of those grandmas who didn't really have much education, and she spent most of her day sitting in the neighborhood in the alley, talking to different people about different things, gossiping, And so my parents both knew that because of her ability to spread gossip, and this was going to become something that people are just going to talk about. So they kind of removed me from that environment from very early on age. It was customary to have your parents help you take care of your children. But my parents decided because of that, they were going to take care of me themselves, even though they were very busy, had multiple jobs, but they made it work. So they shielded me from a lot of that. I remember going to my grandma's neighborhood one day. I was already like 16 or 17, almost. I think I already made it to Peking University, one of our best colleges in China. And people would look at me surprised, like, oh, are you the daughter of so and so's fourth daughter? We didn't think you are this bright. People would say that. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's the result of, 18 years later, 16 years later, they were still talking about that. I had a glimpse of the hope that my parents had of me, judging from my Chinese name, Meng Yi, and it translates literally into the dreamy offspring of the Zha family. So I think just a little pressure, maybe.
So in the story, when your parents come to the US and you pick them up and you're making this pit stop for the ice cream, were they coming to visit or were they coming to stay? And talk about your relationship with them across oceans. And it sounds like now your mom lives with you in Washington. So how did they make that decision to move over? And what was that long distance relationship like?
So that was a few years ago when I settled in my first big girl job in Washington State. So after I purchased a home and got myself settled, that was the time when I decided that I was going to be the adult in the family. I'm no longer somebody's baby girl. I am the person who was able to provide for my family and take care of my family. Inside of me, there was a readiness for a mentality shift, a role shift. And so really picking my parents up during that trip felt different than picking them up for previous trips where they just came and visited here and there. This was going to be my opportunity to introduce them to my household and for them to know that I can provide now. And that was a big deal for a Chinese family, with only child Chinese family. I think about that trip quite a lot. And I remember thinking about just how old they looked and just felt so cheated by time and distance. People talk about not going home or being away from home. I think it's a different story in different cultures, right? But in my culture, because we are so close-knit with our family, it was really a big deal for me to leave for over a decade of time at a time without spending a significant amount of time with my parents. And I remember not having been home for Chinese New Year for 12 years in a row. And think about not going home for Christmas for 12 years in a row, That's really a time of reunion, of happiness, of generation gathering. That was a big deal. But then I thought, this is all going to pass. We're going to be together once again. It was always my plan to take care of my parents. Nothing was going to stop that. And so we would just make up for lost time when I see them, not a big deal. Until I picked them up from the airport and looking at how old they looked, it just felt so devastating. How am I ever going to make up for that 12 years apart? What about my parents that I don't know, that I need to know, like ASAP stat right now? And so it felt like there's urgency to reintegrate again with them.
And so now they live in Washington. Were they excited to make that transition, or was that something you had to do a little arm twisting to get them to agree to?
I think the arm twisting part was what I talked about in the story, the getting them to say yes to me part. I think that it was always a given that we were going to one day be united, however it will be. But I think that they were resisting the idea that they can accept my offering, they can spend my money, they can quote unquote burden me with their needs. That was a huge transition. We're still working on that. I still see my parents reflectively say, no, I don't want that. But not in like, oh, no, thank you, sweetheart. I don't need that way. But in like, no, why would you ask that? Why even waste money? Like, don't be so silly kind of way. And that reflex I'm trying to condition them out of right now still.
And how are they finding life in the US?
My parents are very friendly people. They walk around. They've made a lot of friends. Right now, they're in a honeymoon period with my house, my town, my dog, all these things. So they are doing well right now. I am trying to find them a community where they could speak their language with people around them. And so I think that is going to be a process. But overall, I think that the three of us really just feel just immensely grateful for being able to be together again. It almost feels like it's really now finally us against the world again. Really, the rest, we could make it work. I mean, not that we're suffering or anything, but we could make a lot of things work as long as the three of us are together. And so we talk about things in a different light now. We just have this gratefulness to life.
And has ice cream become a family tradition, or was it a one-time visit to Baskin-Robbins?
I should point out that my mom is actually diabetic. And so it is not a routine thing, but it definitely is a treat. We have Baskin-Robbins here, not far away from my house. And going there has always been just fun. And these days I've been trying to tell them, there's more ice cream out there than the American 31 flavor ice cream. We go to somewhere that are like homemade, local owned, and things like that. So they're expanding their horizon about ice cream.
Well, thank you again for bringing your story to the Nocturnists. It was a complete hit. The audience loved you. They loved your story. I loved your story. And it's been really fun to sit down and get to know you a bit better. Your story is really inspiring, just the resilience of you and your mom and your family. I know that it inspires me. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I just wanted to say that this story, especially the way it was told, and I think eventually when I hear the podcast episode, is a reminder of just a special time of my life where I was simultaneously on my own, doing my own thing, free of all the restraints from medicine, from responsibilities, all these things, just doing my own research for fun, for my own interest. But at the same time, rehearsing and telling and reshaping a story that's about who I am in the background of who my parents are, who my mom was and is. So that separation and connectedness has really made that period of my time so much fun. What a magical time. Thank you for the great reminder of that time of my life.
It's our pleasure. Thanks again. This episode of The Nocturnists was produced, edited, and mixed by John Oliver. Our executive producer is Ali Block, our head of story development is Molly Rose Williams, and Ashley Pettit is our program manager. The Nocturnists is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure that the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. The stories from Season 7 come from our live storytelling show, produced with Bellevue Literary Review on the theme of taking care. The show took place at the Leonard Nimoy Thalia Theatre at Symphony Space in New York City and was originally recorded by Amigo Studio. The show was made possible by the Physicians Foundation and First Responders First. The Nocturnist is also made possible by donations from listeners like you. Thank you so much for supporting our work in storytelling. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app and give us a rating or review to help others find us. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next time.